I'm Ryan Evans, the editor-in-chief of War on the Rocks and the publisher of the Texas National Security Review. Welcome to the second episode of Horns of a Dilemma, our new podcast series with the University of Texas featuring the brilliant leaders and thinkers at UT as well as those who stop in to share their wisdom. This episode features a conversation between William Inboden, the director of the Clement Center and editor-in-chief of the Texas National Security Review, and Mark Updegrove, president and chief executive of the LBJ Foundation and author of the new book, The Last Republicans, Inside the Extraordinary Relationship Between George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. This event was co-sponsored by the Clement Center and the Strauss Center down at UT. Enjoy the show, and don't forget to subscribe to the Horns of a Dilemma feed.
Speaking of our speaker today and teeing this up, many of us here knew Harry Middleton, who unfortunately passed away last year. We just passed the one-year anniversary of his death. He died last year on January 20th, 2017. He was the legendary first director of the LBJ Presidential Library, and he really became the dean of presidential library directors in the 20th century. A legend. He set the standard for presidential library directors across the system of presidential libraries across this country. So he's much missed. But if Harry set the standard for being a presidential library director in the 20th century, our speaker today set the standard for being a presidential library director in the 21st century. So Mark Updegrove's visionary leadership and innovative programming really became an intellectual model for other presidential libraries across the country, especially on how, as the wheels of history and turn and time passes on, how do you take a presidency from 50-some years ago and still keep its insights, its lessons, its events relevant for today's themes and challenges. And so Mark really set the standard for that during his time leading the LBJ Presidential Library. And we're, of course, very excited that after stepping down from that and doing some great work with the Medal of Honor Museum, he's back here and very soon will be taking over as the new president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation. So a very important part of the UT and LBJ community. Along the way, in addition to doing all that, Mark's been a very prolific author, writing 5 books and countless articles for national publications. He's been a very valued partner to the Clements and Strauss Centers and to the LBJ School. And I got to say, on a personal note, he's a remarkable human being, and I'm very blessed to count him as a friend. So our format today, Mark's going to come up and he's going to give some brief framing remarks on this fantastic new book he's written on Bush father and son. And then once he concludes that, I'm going to sit up here with him on stage and we'll do a conversation together, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. And I'm told that there will be opportunities to purchase this book, and maybe even if you are well-behaved and polite, have it signed by the author at the end. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mark Updegrove.
Thanks so much, Will, for that wonderful introduction, and for your 5 years at the helm of the Clement Center. What a remarkable success the Clement Center has been, thanks to Will's leadership. Well, welcome to Seattle. I'm thrilled to be back here. I thought when I agreed to come back to Austin, Texas, we'd have a little Austin, Texas weather. But since I took this post, it's been nothing but rain and gloom. Will mentioned my book, The Last Republicans, and which we'll be talking about today. And I talk about the need to write this book by offering 2 stories. The first is Christmas time, 1990 at Camp David, and the extended Bush clan has come together at Camp David to celebrate the holiday with the 41st President George Herbert Walker Bush. And normally those times were a time of great celebration and a time of great relief for Bush. Bush is always more relaxed when he's around family, and family is an endemic part of being a Bush. But Christmas 1990 was fraught with tension for the elder Bush. At the time, we had yet to go to war in Iraq to drive out Iraqi captors from Kuwait. And George H.W. Bush had a big decision to make. Was he going to send ground troops into Kuwait in order to make that happen? He was trying to orchestrate alliances at the United Nations at that time, but he knew that going to war was the biggest decision that he would make in his presidency, and it weighed heavily on him while he was at Camp David. And one night, he had a dream, and he awakened to the remnants of that dream in his mind. His father, in this dream, who had died in the early 1970s, he found out was still alive. And he was at a golf course when he found this out. And his father, someone said, your father is at an adjacent golf course just across the way, and he's waiting for you in a hotel room there. And so he got in a car and he journeyed over to the hotel room, and he opened the door, and there was his father. In his words, big, strong, highly respected. And he embraced him, and he said, I miss you very much. It just showed how much at that moment he wanted his father's guidance. He wanted his father's counsel. Flash forward to 2002. The Bush extended family has once again come together at Camp David under the presidency of George W. Bush. And George W. Bush is faced with a very similar situation, whether to wage war with Iraq and face down the same tyrant, the same enemy that his father was facing down in 1990, Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein at this point had been flaunting UN sanctions, and George W. Bush, though, has his father to turn to, big, strong, highly respected. And there at Camp David is the one and only time he asks his father for advice. And his father says, and I quote, "You know how tough war is, son, and you have to do everything you can to avoid it. But if the man won't comply, you don't have any choice." The subject of Iraq is a subject of huge speculation about this presidency. There were so many, I think, misconceptions about the Bush father-son relationship. And it was a subject of a lot of talk during the course of Bush 43's presidency. Maureen Dowd of the New York Times expressed mainstream sentiments when she wrote, "W avenged his dad, replaced his dad, made his dad proud, and rebelled against his dad all in the same war." People wondered, why were we going to war with Saddam Hussein? Was it because George H.W. Bush failed to march into Baghdad and take out Saddam in 1990 after liberating Kuwait? Is it because W is trying to avenge his father's death at Saddam, or his father's attempted assassination at the hands of Saddam Hussein shortly after his father left the presidency? Is it because he's trying to prove himself as a great war commander? There's all this speculation swirling around about the influence that the father has, either directly or indirectly, on his son, and how he felt ultimately about the war in Iraq. So this story had to be written. Also, there's only been one father and son president in the history of our nation. John Adams, our second president, and John Quincy Adams, our sixth president. But there's a huge difference in circumstances between those sets of presidencies. In the case of the Adamses, there was 24 years that elapsed between the presidency of John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And John Adams, the elder, was in Quincy, Massachusetts, a 5-day stagecoach ride away from Washington. So he wasn't around to be an immediate resource for his son as he wrestled with the major struggles of his one-term presidency. So the Bush presidency may well be the last father-son presidency, and yet only 8 years had elapsed between their administrations. And George H.W. Bush was a spry 76 when his father took the nation's helm and was available to him either by phone or by fax or in person to be a resource in his son's presidency. So this story had to be written. Getting them to do it, on the other hand, was an entirely different matter. The Bushes, as many of you know, worked for George W. Bush in the White House very nobly, and can tell you that they're famously circumspect, the Bushes. They are very wary of introspection and psychobabble. They're not particularly open. And so it was somewhat difficult convincing them to write this book. I had gotten the permission of the elder Bush on the condition that the younger Bush agreed to. And I'm quite confident that he extended that permission thinking that his son would in no way do it. I think he was very surprised when his son agreed to do it. So I went up to Dallas warily about the meeting, wondering if I was going to get shot down. I knew the elder Bushes pretty well. I didn't know the younger Bushes as well. And W sat at his desk, and he had his feet propped up. He was fingering an unlit cigar. And to my great shock, he said, "I've decided this story needs to be written, and I've decided that you're the guy to do it." I was so surprised I didn't have a recording device with me. And he immediately launched into his thoughts about his father. So we talked for about an hour. I ran out of the office, literally down to my car, and started scribbling feverishly to ensure that I got all of the really good content that he gave me in that first meeting. We had about 8 subsequent interviews. I got about 6 interviews from the elder Bush, and there was my story. I'll happily talk about some of the revelations that they offered to me. The book, when I started writing it, was not called The Last Republicans. The working title was 41 and 43, A Love Story. But it became quite clear to me throughout the course of writing this book that the Bushes represented an end to a type of republicanism. I thought in the spring of 2015, make that 2016, that I would call this The Last Republicans, as insurgents in the Republican Party started taking things over, and the establishment Republicans were losing ground. I thought that was a good title, The Last Republicans. And then George W. Bush allegedly said to a group of aides, in fact, Will, you might have been among them, "I may well be the last Republican president." It's something that he told me in May of 2016. And I thought to myself, well, now that he said it, I can't use it. My wife says, no, that's all the more reason to use it. But it was clear to me that whether Hillary Clinton won the election of 2016 or Donald Trump prevailed, again, there was an end to a type of republicanism that was embodied, exemplified by the elder and younger Bushes. I sat in the elder Bush's office in May of 2016, and I delivered the news that John Kasich had just dropped out of the presidential race. He had lined up behind John Kasich, not officially, but personally, after his son Jeb had dropped out of the race. And I told him this, and I said, "What are you going to do? What are you going to vote for?" And he said, "Well, I have to think about it, but I may well vote for Hillary." And I was shocked. I was just absolutely shocked. As we talked in subsequent interviews, both of the Bushes shared their unvarnished views about Donald Trump. And it didn't surprise me when I heard that they were not particular fans of Donald Trump. One letter gave a clue to that, a letter that was written by the elder Bush to his sons during the last few weeks of the Nixon presidency in 1974. At the time, George Herbert Walker Bush was the chairman of the Republican National Committee. And he thought of Nixon as almost a father figure who had taken a great interest in his political career and had rescued him from a potential political obscurity after Bush had lost a race for the Senate in 1970. This is after losing another race for the Senate in 1964, going on to 2 terms in Congress, and then staking all that on another run for the Senate and losing. And Nixon appointed him as our ambassador to the United Nations and then brought him back to Washington to become the chairman of the Republican National Committee. And as Nixon did to the country and to his cabinet and to his staff, he lied about the misdeeds of Watergate. And about 2 weeks before Nixon resigned the office, Bush wrote to his sons. And among the things in that very potent, very seminal letter, he wrote, "In judging your president, give him credit for enormous achievements, but understand that power accompanied by arrogance is very dangerous. It's particularly dangerous when those with no real experience have it, for they can damage our great institutions." So that was a clue to how they might, the Bushes and George H.W. Bush in particular, might feel about Donald Trump. Those sentiments were confirmed to me when I spoke to both of the Bushes. This is prior to the election of 2016, but at the height of the election cycle. One of the things that George H.W. Bush said to me is, he's a blowhard. He said, I don't like him, and I'm not excited about him being a leader. When the book came out, it broke in the New York Times and on CNN, and there was that headline, George H.W. Bush calls Trump a blowhard. I learned later that according to the Merriam-Webster folks, that searches for the definition of the word blowhard increased by 94,000%. True story. So it wasn't a great surprise. There was a wonderful anecdote that was told to me by both Bush and his chief of staff, Gene Becker, about the elder Bush as a former president, just a couple of years into his post-presidency, waiting for his plane to be maintained at a private airport in Boston, when the attendant at this private terminal came to his chief of staff to let her know that Donald Trump was about to arrive, and would the former president like to say hello to Mr. Trump? And so Gene Becker, Bush's chief of staff, dutifully brought him this proposition. And Bush was reading the Wall Street Journal at the time, and he had it in front of his face, and he lowered the paper, and she said, we understand that Donald Trump is coming through the airport, and would you like to say hello? And Bush said, hell no. And he put up the newspaper again. And then he lowered it again. And he said, whoa, wait a minute. Is he coming this way? And she said, I don't know. And he put up the newspaper again to shield his face in the event that Donald Trump passed by. So his feelings about Donald Trump was the mid-90s. It was somewhere between 94 and 1996. Donald Trump had already come up on George H.W. Bush's radar in a political sense when Lee Atwater brought him the proposition of putting Donald Trump on the ticket as his vice president in 1988. This was after Donald Trump offered the overture to Atwater. And Atwater was somewhat intrigued by it. He thought it could mix things up a little bit. And George H.W. Bush immediately shot that suggestion down. George W. Bush was a little less blunt, but just as clear. And one of the things he said is that one of the things my father taught me about leadership is the importance of humility. And when Donald Trump said, I am my own advisor, I thought, wow, this guy doesn't know what it is to be president. Because his feeling was that you're never going to be omniscient. You're never going to know all the facts. You're never going to be the expert on every topic, considering the enormous wealth of issues and situations that come across your desk. So you have to rely on people to give you information that you use to make the decisions of your presidency. And it takes humility to do that sometimes. So his feelings about Donald Trump weren't a great surprise either. The Bushes exemplify a kind of compassionate conservatism that we don't see exemplified by our current president. That's one major difference. George H.W. Bush, of course, campaigned under the prospect of giving us a kinder, gentler nation. When his son campaigned, he campaigned under a platform of compassionate conservatism. We don't see a great deal of compassion, and in some cases, we don't see a great deal of conservatism from Donald Trump. I think they also exemplify a certain idealism, a certain openness, and a certain commitment to an engagement in the world that we haven't seen from this presidential administration, which has been, to a large extent, very xenophobic, very nativist, and very isolationist. Those are anathema to the Bush brand of thinking about foreign policy. So I'm delighted to be here today. I'm delighted to answer any questions you have, and I'm equally delighted to be having a conversation with my friend Will Inboden. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, well, thank you very much, Mark, for teeing that up. Number of questions to go through here, and then we'll also take a few from the audience. First one is, obviously, when you started this book project, you had some familiarity with the Bushes. You'd spent time with both of them. You'd certainly read a lot about them. So, you were not going into this with a purely blank slate. And yet, of course, as with any book, you learn a lot of things along the way. What surprised you the most in the course of researching and writing this book about either of them or both of them together? What was one of the most noteworthy revelations for you personally as the author?
There are two, Will. The thing is that you really want to delve into a subject as an historian when there are a lot of misconceptions around it. And there were so many misconceptions, as I mentioned in my remarks, about George W. Bush in particular, but also about the relationship between father and son. One of the misconceptions, I think, is about George W. Bush as a ne'er-do-well, as the one who was not the political heir apparent in the Bush family. That's patently untrue. I think there was one of the reasons that people feel that way is because Jeb is a far more serious and studious person. He got his life on track at a relatively early age after having a few wayward years in high school. He met the woman who would become his wife, and she sort of set him on the straight and narrow. And he devoted himself to showing her that he was a serious and auspicious person. And so he set on a path that really looked a little like his father's in terms of what he achieved at a relatively early age. George H.W. Bush, I think, gave himself a lot of leeway. And while he's a baby boomer, nominally, George W., yeah. George W. is a member of the Aquarian generation. But he was not a hippie, but he did give himself sort of time and leeway to find himself. And, his 20s are a bit wayward. They're kind of directionless. But one of the things that shows his ability is he runs for Congress in West Texas in 1978. And it's a very impressive run. He gets the nomination, the Republican nomination against all odds, and then he very narrowly loses out to Kent Hance, his Democratic opponent, in a very heavily Democratic district. And his father's pretty impressed by that. He also, the father, taps his son to aid him in his 1988 campaign, his presidential campaign. And the Bushes, George, Laura, and their twins, move to Washington so he can aid in that effort. And he becomes his father's go-to guy on on many things political. And he can trust him, of course. There's not the issue of trust. But one of the reasons that there's the misconception that Jeb was the heir apparent is that in 1994, when both the Bush sons ran, Jeb Bush in Florida and George W. Bush in Texas, for their state houses, the Bushes believed that Lawton Chiles, who is the Democratic candidate in Florida, is vulnerable. And Ann Richards, who's the Democratic candidate and the governor here in Texas, is not as vulnerable. She has approval ratings that are in the mid-60s. So they think that George W. Bush's effort is quixotic. They don't think that he has a chance. So that, I think, leads to this notion that the Bushes don't have faith in George W. Bush as being the standard bearer of the next generation. In fact, Barbara Bush says to him pointedly, "You can't win." But it's only because they've handicapped those races, and erroneously, as it happens, because George W. Bush wins in 1994, and Jeb Bush loses, again, against all odds. So that's one misconception. I think the other is the father as a heavy-handed political influence while his son is in office. This is something we all speculated about at cocktail parties, I think, during the aughts. What is 41 saying to 43 about his presidency? What advice is he getting? Is he schooling him on this or that? But one of the things that George W. Bush will say is that because of his father's inherent humility, he refrained from giving advice because he knew the office. And number one, he knew his son didn't need the added extra burden of somebody else weighing in on his presidency. So he was very passive. He would give him advice when called upon, but that was also very sparingly on George W. Bush's part. The other thing he knew is that while he was getting intelligence briefings as a former president, they weren't as comprehensive as those briefings that his son was getting. So his son was far more schooled in the facts and in the intelligence than he was. So he refrained for those reasons as well. But it was impossible for us all not to think there's got to be something going on more between those two.
All right, so next question, I'm going to draw a little bit on some of my own even personal memories, but the theme for the question here is how history can change our perspectives on someone. So I was in college during the first Gulf War, and I remember widespread protests on my campus. This was George Bush's imperialist war for oil. I remember the fierce debate in the Senate, which, as you may recall, the Senate only authorized the use of force. This is the 91 Gulf War by 2 votes, almost. My first boss, Sam Nunn, voted against it, even though it was very hawkish. It was overwhelming Democratic opposition. It was going to be a new Vietnam. Then, of course, Jimmy Carter lobbied against it again in the UN Security Council. Unheard of to have a former U.S. president go to the Security Council and say, "Don't authorize the current president's war." Bat's written quite a bit about this.
Almost a violation of the Logan Act.
Yeah.
In fact, Scowcroft told the elder Bush it was a violation of the Logan Act.
Then, of course, Bush 43. We've got a few alums here, Steve Slick, myself, Paul Miller. When we were working there, we were being called war criminals. But Bush himself was being called a war criminal. And those were, the polite things that he was being called. I mean, just horribly vilified. I loved, let's read briefly towards the end of your book, you've got this great tweet from Glenn Greenwald, Bobby Chesney's good friend. Bobby back there. 2005, Greenwald says, George W. Bush is a pillaging, torturing war criminal who led a city drown. 2017, I may have disagreed with Bush, but he was a good man, all in capitalized. And meanwhile, former President Obama has said that Bush 41 was a role model for him. You see where I'm going with this? At the time when partisan passions are very hot, when we're in the midst of these real controversies, these guys were really, really criticized. Bush 43 leaves office with some of the lowest approval ratings in history. But we're just a few years later, and there's quite a bit of Bush revisionism going on, and maybe a little bit of nostalgia, especially for the father, but also for the son, who's, post office approval ratings are now up into the 60s, I think. Yeah. How do we make sense of this? Both, what is the perspective that history can bring to looking at these reassessments, but also what, if any, cautionary notes are there for us about even some of the partisan passions of the present day? And I'm not going to ask you to speculate on how Donald Trump will be regarded in history. We're not going there. But it is perhaps a little bit chastening for all of us on whatever side of the aisle we're on that what may seem like the worst, most appalling presidency in history then at the time may later turn out a little differently.
Yeah, and that happens frequently in history. It takes us at least a generation to take an objective measure of a presidential administration. And that's because it takes a lot of time for passions to cool. And in the case of George H.W. Bush, he's one of the very few presidents who I think has seen a pretty accurate reflection of what history will say about him while he's alive. But part of the reason is because he left his presidency pretty cleanly. There were no major unresolved issues. We had seen the fall of the Iron Curtain. And Bush was instrumental in helping put the pieces back together in the wake of the the end of the Cold War. He reunited Germany. We saw the Gulf War ended clean. We decided not to go into Kuwait. That's one of the reasons.
Iraq.
After Kuwait, we decided not to go into Iraq. And that's one of the reasons. He wanted a clean end to that. He didn't want to go back to the UN and say, yeah, I just told you it was going to be Kuwait, but we decided to go into Iraq now. So I think we're seeing a pretty good reflection of how he will stand up in the eyes of history. And he may well be regarded as our best one-term president, in my view. Certainly, in my view, the best one-term president of the 20th century. You've got Polk and a few other pretty good one-termers. But I think that George H.W. Bush is up there. He might consider that a backhanded compliment, but it is a compliment nonetheless. For George W. Bush, it's going to take us far longer to get an accurate read on how he'll stand up in history. I think he, in some ways, he's a lot like Lyndon Johnson. For Lyndon Johnson, it took us at least 2 generations for passions to cool over the war in Vietnam, which so divided this nation. And I think that now Johnson is justifiably given credit for some of the great accomplishments of the Great Society, in particular civil rights. Clare Boothe Luce used to lecture presidents, used to say, you will be remembered in one sentence. What will your sentence be? And that's the way that we ultimately remember presidents. It's in a very cursory way. So for LBJ, Vietnam's going to be in that sentence, but I think it's going to be counterbalanced by his championing civil rights, since race is such an endemic part of the American story. For George H.W. Bush, that sentence has to do with an elegant end to the Cold War, which could have been a whole lot messier than it was. But for George W. Bush, it's complicated. What we know now is just what you read, Will, is he's a good man. People thought he was a war criminal, that we were going to war for oil and all these things. Or Halliburton, or some sinister motive. When you talk to George W. Bush, it's pretty clear why he wanted to go to war. And I think he subscribes to the Wilsonian notion of democratizing parts of the world in order to have a more peaceful world. And he saw that we had this opportunity to do so at a very perilous time. We could kill 2 birds with one stone. We could further the war on terror and take out an ally of Osama bin Laden. There was that theory is somewhat erroneous in my view, and we see the mistakes there. But I think he also believed that if we democratized Iraq, it would have a transformational effect on the Middle East and would make for a more peaceful world. Because of the messy aftermath in Afghanistan and Iraq, it's going to take us, I think, at least 2 generations to get an objective view of George W. Bush.
Well, that does segue into my next question, which is Bush father and son neither came into office planning on being a wartime president, and yet both of them were in different ways. Bush 41 with the Panama invasion, and then, of course, the first Gulf War, and Bush 43, of course, with Afghanistan and Iraq. And they, in their own different ways, had also had formative experiences in their younger years. Bush 41, with World War II, being the youngest naval aviator in the war, shot down that really miraculous survival. Bush 43 coming of age during the much more tumultuous Vietnam era, and of course, being a National Guard pilot. How would you compare their approaches to the commander-in-chief role, especially leading a nation at war?
Yeah, I've talked about the title of this book, and I've thought about at one point calling it The Diplomat and the Decider. The Diplomat and the Decider. George H.W. Bush.
By the way, since Mark didn't use that, there's a dissertation title for any grad students.
George H.W. Bush is the ultimate diplomat. He's just a master diplomat. He didn't plan to be a diplomat. In fact, he didn't plan to be an expert in foreign policy at all. As I mentioned, he had gone into elected politics, waged 2 battles for the Senate in 1964 and 1970, lost both, but also was elected to Congress in 1966 and then reelected in 1968. After he left, he went on to a series of appointments: the American ambassador to the United Nations, chairman of the Republican National Committee, special envoy to China. I mean, he had these amazing diplomatic assignments where he learned the art of diplomacy, and he was a natural at it, given his inherent personality traits. The Bushes are very open, very hospitable. They care about you, and all those traits came to bear in him being a really good diplomat. One of the reasons that George H.W. Bush is so effective in the wake of the Cold War, well, two reasons. Number one, because of his inherent humility. He resisted the temptation to dance on the wall. He resisted the temptation to go over when the Berlin Wall had fallen to rubble and proclaim America's victory in the Cold War. One of the reasons he didn't do so is he didn't want to compromise the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, and he wanted to keep that diplomatic channel open so that they could negotiate in the wake of the Cold War. And he didn't, and he didn't want to compromise the leadership to embolden hardliners who might rise up and try to take out Gorbachev. So that diplomacy really came to bear, and you can see when he's commander-in-chief, he gets this unprecedented coalition of 29 nations to come together over driving the Iraqi captors out of Kuwait. It's a remarkable diplomatic achievement. I mean, you've got China and the Soviet Union coming together, or make that Russia, coming together, supporting.
Actually, no, still Soviet Union at the time. That's right. Yeah, they had a few more months of Soviet Union.
Couple more months of Soviet Union, right. So they're about to split up. Yeah. But they all both come together. I mean, this is a triumphant diplomatic achievement. So I think he is the consummate diplomat. George W. Bush is, as he called himself, the decider. You saw this firsthand, Will. And those who knew him earlier in his life would say he had this preternatural confidence in his ability to absorb information and to spit out a decision. And when he calls himself the decider, it's because I think he believes he has that innate ability. And Will, you could talk to this more so than me, but those around him seem to have great confidence in his ability to do just that. And you can see from high school days on that those around Bush see this natural ability in him to be a decider. So this whole notion of Dick Cheney being this kind of Machiavellian puppet master who's pulling the strings of the Bush presidency behind the scenes is absolutely ludicrous to anybody who knows George W. Bush. And I know this is maybe a family crowd, but one of the things he said to me is the notion of Rumsfeld and Cheney making decisions in his presidency. He said those guys never made one effing decision. So
the
I think
podcast is a family-friendly podcast. So thank you for that. Right.
So the diplomat and the decider is how I would characterize them as commanders-in-chief.
Yeah. No, I still remember when I'd first started on the NSC staff and was talking to our boss, Steve Hadley, at the time about some of the processes. And I said, well, what if, my directorate's having a disagreement with another directorate? How, we all want to be collegial. How do you handle this? What I didn't say to Hadley is I was thinking, what if Steve Slick is, disagreeing with me on something, right? And Hadley said, look, he said, we got a president who loves to make decisions. Kick it up. Kick it up. As we were saying, kick it up, meaning kick it into the Oval, give him the options, let him decide. He relishes that. So that was very much the ethos.
And Will, one of the things he said to me is, when I was asking why he didn't draw on his father more for advice, he said, because I was comfortable that I was getting advice from both sides of any issue. I didn't need an outsider to give me more advice. I had great advisors. There were some people who would debate this as well. They would say that Rumsfeld and Cheney were putting their thumbs on the scale and not giving them information from both sides, but weighing it from one side in particular. That's for other historians to debate. But Bush was confident from his perspective that he was hearing both sides of the issue.
So further to this, especially on comparing and contrasting the two administrations, as you described quite a bit in the book, and I know you interviewed a lot of these people, almost all of Bush 43's senior team, with the notable exception of Rumsfeld, but almost everyone else had worked closely together and held pretty senior positions in the Bush 41 administration also. I mean, Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense, Colin Powell, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Andy Card, Deputy Chief of Staff, Condi Rice, Senior Director on the NSC, Steve Hadley, Assistant Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, of course, CIA Director. And one could even, in a way, put in Scowcroft and Baker. Scowcroft chairs PIFIAB early on Baker, Florida recount, and then Baker Hamilton. There were some outliers. So this team that had worked very closely together in Bush 41 then is brought back together in different roles in the Bush 43 administration, and yet there were some of them worked well together in Bush 43, but also some pretty fierce differences. How did you think that through in working on the book? How do you help us understand that people who had worked closely together and occupied one particular perhaps worldview in one context, then in a different administration ended up being in some cases, quite a bit at odds with each other. In other cases, still working closely together, although with some different alignments.
Yeah, this team, it's interesting. When Bush puts together his team, he taps a lot of the Bush 41 alums in order to round out his staff. One of the things that Andy Card told me, though, is that Rumsfeld's appointment as Secretary of Defense was very pointed. And just as his father appointed Dan Quayle as vice president, even though James Baker wanted it, the reason he did that is to say, you're not the vice president. This is not a co-presidency. I'm going to tell you what role you're going to play. And my guy is Dan Quayle, and I'll figure out what role you can play. And then he, of course, went on to be Secretary of Defense, which is a pretty big role.
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State, excuse me. It's a very big role. But then when George W. Bush is staffing, he chooses as his Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. Andy Card said that was his way of telling his father, this is my presidency. Because Donald Rumsfeld had been an adversary of his father's, particularly in the Ford administration. David Hume Kennerly, who was Jerry Ford's photographer, said that they were like two cocks in the barnyard, kind of walking around and kind of very belligerent toward one another and very, very combative. So that was a political rival that he had tapped for that reason. Andy Card was certain to say to his father, this is my presidency. I might be tapping a lot of your alums, but this is going to be my administration. The interesting thing is, a lot of people talk about how Cheney changed. Cheney will say that I never changed. And in fact, those around in the Bush 41 administration would tell you that Dick Cheney was often the dissenting voice on a lot of the arguments that came up. He was just outvoiced by Scowcroft, Baker, and Bush 41 himself. But he had the same very conservative views during the Bush 41 administration that he carried into the Bush 43 administration. I think that that's largely true. But the Bush 43 team is somewhat, I guess, estranged from one another at certain points. Colin Powell is really the outlier in that administration. And I think that his estrangement, his alienation, is of great concern to Bush 41. That's the one thing he vocalizes to those around him. In particular, Brent Scowcroft, who Bat Sparrow has written about very well in his biography of Scowcroft, and James Baker. Those are the two people that Bush 41 talks to. Mostly he listens to them because he's very concerned about, even to his closest friends, compromising his son's presidency. He doesn't want to be a dissenting voice. He doesn't want to be the father who's pouring cold water on his son's presidency. So he doesn't say a lot. He's extremely circumspect about anything relating to the son's presidency.
Yeah. And I'll also add as a footnote to that from my own personal observations is when evaluating the Bush 43 presidency, there's pretty meaningful differences between the first and second term across a number of domains, but especially even on personnel. So by the time Bob Gates comes in as Secretary of Defense and Condi as Secretary of State, you had a quite unified and collegial national security team with Hadley, Rice, and Gates. Sounds like it'd be a good consulting firm, which it is now. So
Right.
Rice, Hadley, Gates, right?
And Cheney's not marginalized, but Cheney's influence wanes significantly.
Yeah, his influence waned significantly in the second term.
As Condi Rice's influence rises.
Just ask Scooter Libby, right?
Right,
in
right.
terms of, Cheney's
exactly
diminished
right.
influence. So, All right, one more question from your moderator here before we turn over to the audience. Let's indulge an admittedly impossible counterfactual question, but it's still a fun one to ask. How might history have unfolded if Texas businessman Ross Perot never entered the 1992 race, and then Bush 41 had won a second term, had beat Bill Clinton and won a second term?
My guess is that if Ross Perot hadn't challenged George Herbert Walker Bush in 1992, Bill Clinton still would have won.
Oh, okay.
That's my view. I mean, this is obviously a hypothetical, but and if you talk to those around Bush 41, they'll say the same thing. Bill Clinton was an unstoppable political force, and with the violation of the no new tax pledges, Bush has already alienated the conservatives in the party.
You got the primary challenge from Pat Buchanan.
The primary, exactly, and that coalition has already been largely weakened. But Clinton is this fresh face. The Republicans had already held the White House for 12 years. Asking for another term is a virtual political impossibility, no matter who the candidate might be. Particularly, again, with the violation of that no new taxes pledge. But if he had one in 1992 and going on to another term, I don't know if you would have George W. Bush throwing his hat in the ring at any point. He was, at that point, doing very well with the Texas Rangers. He was a very successful businessman. I think he would tell you that as long as his father was in office, he and his brother were not going to throw their hats in the ring because they knew it would be a referendum on their father's presidency. They didn't want to compromise their father's presidency. In fact, Barbara Bush was an advocate of them staying out of the political ring in order not to compromise their father in any way. So it's hard to say, Will, but I think my own view is one of the reasons that George W. Bush was so appealing in 2000 was that we had gone through 2 terms of Clinton. George H.W. Bush, when he left the Oval Office, had enormously high approval ratings. His presidency was looking better and better by the day. His character was sterling, particularly compared to that of Bill Clinton's, as his was compromised by the Monica Lewinsky scandal and some of the other scandals that followed Bill Clinton throughout his tenure as president. So I think that was enormously beneficial. Just the character, the Bush brand, which represented character, was enormously beneficial in having a rub-off effect on George W. Bush. And being the namesake of the 41st president doesn't hurt either.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, folks, our time is up. Please do not leave here without buying a copy of the book, and Mark will be happy to sign them. We'll have him right out here. So, Mark, thanks so much.
Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for a great conversation. Good to see you.
Thanks for listening. Check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org and subscribe to the Horns of a Dilemma feed.